Over the past several updates of D&D, the community has begun to notice something interesting. Wizards of the Coast has been removing negative modifiers from racial choices, and this has begun to strike a chord specifically with the more hardcore and longer-term D&D fans. These more long-term D&D community fans have had a hard time with these changes, and there's been a lot of reasons as to why. These have been staples of the game for a long time. Orcs have had negative intelligence modifiers. The more monstrous races usually did. Negative modifiers were in fact one of the larger core mechanics of previous editions of D&D. And as time has gone on, they've begun to become more and more outcried over this change that is apparently becoming. And of course, many people have begun to outcry these sorts of things as the game pushing an agenda of political correctness. Controversy in the D&D community, political correctness, and the claims of an agenda? Well, we all know that's something I can't help but stick my head into, even if I probably shouldn't. The D&D racial trait conversation is a very difficult one to talk about and has a lot of nuance to it. So let's talk about it. Play Your Role is a proud affiliate of Only Crits Dice. Check the link in the description for beautiful hard-edged dice sets as well as a coupon code in order to be able to get 15% off your next order. If you want amazing high-quality tabletop products as well as to support the channel, please go ahead and check it out. Enjoy the video. The first thing we have to understand while talking about this concept is why it is that people are upset about this. See, the concept of negative modifiers for races has been something that's existed for some time now. In past editions of D&D, monstrous races specifically often have negative modifiers to their intelligence or their different mental stats. It was just something that had become expected. In fact, negative modifiers were something that were so common, it was part of the base part of the game. You often built your build or your character around those sorts of modifiers, shoring up where you had weaknesses or making sure that the party would be there in order to be able to compensate for them. It was an important part of the game, and many people have begun to become upset about it. The most common argument that I've seen, specifically on the comments of my videos, have talked about the fact that it is just something that is not necessary, or it is taking political correctness too far, or it is looking too deep into things. And I do think that there's a lot of reasons of why that's a little bit misguided. Now let me make it incredibly clear and add some disclaimers. People hate it when I put disclaimers. They will often complain that I am talking about things that don't matter, but context is always necessary. One, I do not believe my opinions to be fully right. In fact, you can go look at any of my videos and I never do believe that they are fully right or correct. However, I do stand by my opinions until being given a reasonable alternative that I must then consider. That's how discussion works. If you want to be fully 100% right on something, a person must be able to look at the other side of the coin. They must be able to hear other arguments, because if you decide something is correct without knowing what else is out there, you have not made a decision based off of any sort of knowledge, you've made it based off of ignorance. And that can be a very dangerous thing. So I do not assume my opinions are right, though I do stand by them until being given a better alternative point of view that will cause me to think and reevaluate.
Am I wrong? You're not wrong, Walter. You're just an asshole.
2, I'm aware that this is a hot button topic and I'm talking about some pretty controversial issues here. I know that I'm going to get some people who are probably already angry in the comments before even watching the rest of the video. It is the nature of the beast. However, as always when I talk about these sorts of things, I ask that everybody keep things cordial and civil. Have a conversation and discuss. There is never a side that is 1000% right. There's always something wrong on each side of an argument, even if one is very, very right and one is very, very wrong. There's always something in the middle that both sides have missed. So please have a civil conversation and do not shut people down. You cannot make a decision based off of incomplete information. And the best way to get that information is to go to the other side. So with that being talked about, what is it that we're discussing today? Well, negative racial modifiers. I have mentioned in my videos before where I put the pretty hot take out there that I thought the fact that they were removing the negative racial modifiers was a good thing. I said good on them for that. And many, many people complained about me doing this. Many people began to get upset about that concept, and I noticed a general conversation beginning to develop around the topic, one that I've seen outside of my videos, just many places in the D&D community. This idea that racial modifiers do not inherently mean racism, and I think that is correct to a degree. See, yes, you can look at something and see a negative modifier in something and understand that it is not racism. You can see that and not attribute it to a race in the real world and assume that one specific type of people all have negative intelligence modifiers. But you're still missing out on the core aspect of this. See, here's the deal. When you're looking at a racial bonus, you have to consider what that means for your world. Hello everybody, Jay from the future here. As always, whenever I talk about more serious topics, I was listening to what I was saying and felt that I could have explained myself a little bit better, and so that's what this is. To be clear, I don't think negative modifiers was a terrible thing. If you were to go back to even 2nd edition, you could see that almost every single race had a negative modifier somewhere. Even things like the elves or the humans or the things that you would quintessentially associate with humans or above superior humans, like elves typically are portrayed, they still had negative modifiers. So I am not saying that negative modifiers were a bad thing or that they were only attributed to monstrous races or anything like that. The point that I'm trying to make here is that negative modifiers, or attributing negative traits to an entire race, stereotypes and brings them all into one bubble. Which is totally fine. I mean, that's something that happens in the real world. How many times have we stereotyped people and therefore racism becomes a part of that? And let me make it clear, that doesn't mean stereotyping and bringing people into a bubble like that is okay. I'm just saying if you want to make your world a little bit more realistic, that does make sense, because it does happen in the real world. However, it becomes harmful when you assume that that's something that you could just do without it being an issue. Yes, an entire race can get stereotyped, but that doesn't mean that they are all going to be exactly like that. Maybe most orcs do have a negative intelligence modifier, but not all of them do. And if they all do, then that means something way more important to your world building implications, which I'm going to get to here in a second. Regardless, the main thing I'm trying to nail down here is I don't think negative traits, modifiers, or alignment were ever made with the intent of racism, but they do inherently create a problem by doing so if you're not taking that into account with your world building. And I'm going to touch on that, so let's get to that. When you're looking at a race with a negative modifier, what does that mean for you and for your world? It means inherently that that race, that entire people, all have negative intelligence modifiers. That is a huge thing to put into your game and has massive consequences, but oftentimes gets ignored. And that's the most important and first point I want to touch on here. If I were to say that all orcs have negative intelligence modifiers, every single one of them, that is a huge decision that has world building implications. And that really does frustrate me when people don't take that into account. The most common argument I saw in my comments was that I should be able to look at a fantasy race and separate it from a real person. Fantasy races are not real people, and you are correct. However, to make the assumption that an entire group of people can all be that uniform and all share that same negative trait does say some certain things about the people who are holding that belief. Say I believe that all orcs have a negative intelligence modifier. Okay, well that inherently means that I probably can assume that an entire group of people can have a single negative trait, which is just inherently not true. Humans are varied and diverse, and so should the races. Now, that is jumping to the extreme, and I will admit that. Yes, that is a fantasy race thing that I can then separate. I shouldn't be able to think something in D&D and automatically assume that's what exists in real life. That's what occurred during the Satanic Panic, didn't it?
The game is played in a group, and the guide, or dungeon master,
you enter a very small room.
Talks the players through the fictional, sometimes violent adventures they will go on.
However, it does mean that I am willing to accept that in this fantasy world, there is an entire group of people that have this negative trait about them, and I'm not going to consider that more. And that is something else. Because if you're going to say an entire race of people has a negative modifier, that means that you have not considered the implications of that, because it is huge. And unfortunately, if you're not taking that fully into account, I believe that leads to lazy storytelling and world building. If there's an entire race of people that automatically have that ingrained into them and there's nothing they could do about it, that has huge implications on the world. That means that a god decided that all of them should not be able to be smart. And that's a big thing to take into account. Okay, this entire race of people has been inhibited from being smart because a fantasy god told them so. What do your characters think about that god now? What does the world think about that god? What does that race think? That race is probably infuriated that that has been removed from them. That's a huge thing to consider. Or even worse, alignment. A lot of people are upset because you cannot have evil races anymore. Which, one, I think that is hugely lazy to consider. If you sit there and say, oh, I can't have all of my drow be evil anymore, or I can't have all of my orcs be evil anymore, how am I supposed to have villains? You are missing out on such a core aspect of storytelling. You can have all the orcs be evil. That's okay. But the thing that you're being lazy about is you're not asking yourself why.
How'd you know who the goodies and the baddies are?
And that is such a huge miss for the game. Why are all of the orcs evil? Why have they become this way? What is it that they've grown up in? What is their environment? What have they been made to do? Have the gods made them to be evil? If the gods have made them to be evil, then that is a huge implication, because that means there's a god out there who decided that an entire race of people should be evil for the sake of being evil, and the other gods in the universe should probably have a problem with that. See, to just assume a single group of people can have a singular trait and all will do so because they were made that way, because it's fantasy, but not consider further past that is, in my very strong opinion, lazy storytelling. And that is a problem because we don't want to be lazy in our storytelling. Now, do we? We want to create a fascinating narrative, an exciting story, something for everybody at the table to enjoy. And yes, you probably don't want to go into a lot of those factors. When I sit down at my table, most of my players don't want to deal with racism.
Yes, why do we have to have evil?
We're playing a fantasy game. Why should racism exist? But if I automatically assume a whole group of people can all have a single negative trait, I have opened up that world to racism. Because now there is a race that has been distinctly made to be absolutely different. And here's one of the main sticking points of why I find that so harmful. Because if you have chosen to do that, if you have chosen to have this entire race have this same single negative trait, especially if it is something to do with alignment, if they are all evil, you haven't created a race of people, have you? You've created a monster, a stat block, because they no longer have free choice. They don't have free will, and so what is the point exactly in having them as a playable race? One of the core points of D&D is choice, free choice, storytelling, and one of the core parts of being a human is the ability to make that choice. And so when we create these races, the reason that you can choose different races, but we don't automatically say, oh, that's just a monster stat block, is because they have free choice. They have free will. And if you are to say that every single individual from this group of people all have this same alignment, you've removed a large portion of that free choice. Yes, you can make the argument that an evil person could do a good thing. That is absolutely true. But you have still assigned an entire group of people that they must make evil decisions. They must have the world outlook of being evil. And that is not a race anymore. It's not a group of people. It is a monster stat block because they're made to do one thing: be a villain.
Oh, you're a villain, all right. Just not a super one.
Yeah? What's the difference?
Presentation!
And that is why this sort of thing can become very harmful. I am not saying that people cannot separate fantasy races from real races. I truly believe that. And if you think and see a group of people in a fantasy race and say they're all evil, that does not make you racist. It does not mean that you are a terrible person in real life, but it does mean that you haven't seen past that. It means you haven't thought further forward. And that is something to reflect on. If you can see those things and not think about them critically, one, I truly believe it's lazy storytelling and there's an opportunity to grow in your storytelling. But two, it means you're probably less likely to think about those things in real life. You have probably not gotten into the point or had the opportunity to develop yourself to see past that. And those things are very important for critical thinking. And that is mainly what I base my channel on. The ability to critically think and create conversations so that we can grow as a community and have better games at our table. That's the entire mission statement of what I'm trying to do on this channel. And this is a core part of that. It is very important to me that we seriously look at this concept, seriously look at what it is that we're thinking about races and why Wizards of the Coast is doing this. The removal of the negative modifiers does two different things. It means that we have more ability to make the sort of characters we want, but two, it means that if we want to have a race like this, if we want to have a race with one single negative trait all across them, we now have to actually think and world build and put in that effort. It is lazy storytelling to not be able to do that, and I think without the negative modifiers, without the alignment there, now as dungeon masters and players, we have to put more effort to be able to create a more interesting world, and I think that is a very good thing. And I don't think it's something that we should be upset about. So ultimate conclusion, no, it's not bad to have those negative modifiers. But if you weren't looking past those negative modifiers in the first place, it does mean it is likely you were having a harmful mindset, at least in my opinion. I will continue to state that this is a conversation. It is a discussion that anybody can have, and I will gladly hear things out. But it is important to have the conversation and not shut it down. And no offense to the D&D community, especially the older hardcore community, you guys have been very good at shutting down conversation in the past rather than having an actual conversation. And that's just part of the internet as well. I'm not even going to pretend that I haven't participated in it sometimes. But it is important to have these topics so that we can learn and grow as people, a community, and as players at our table. So go out into the world, make your own, you beautiful bastards. Don't forget to have a great day, and never forget to play a role. A huge shout out to all those divine bastards over on our Patreon that helped make this video happen. I'd also like to take an additional very personal thank you to BKBW, Diet Blue, Duplicolor, Malcadil, I hope I pronounced that right, Sassy Cat Productions, Sorit, Supreme Court, Tineye, and Void Mystic. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without our patrons, and we are very thankful for your continued support. You guys are the absolute best, and I will never take your support for granted.